The laughter echoed through the grand hall of the Keth dominion. 100 alien voices, guttural, clicking, some even shrieking, blended together in mocking amusement. From where he stood, Captain Elias Carter of the Terran Diplomatic Corps could feel the disdain rolling off them like heat from an engine room. The Keth, towering insectoid warlords, loomed over the smaller delegates, their gleaming carapaces catching the bioluminescent glow of the chamber's high ceilings. At the center of it all sat the Keth Imperator, a hulking mass of exoskeletal armor and twitching mandibles, watching with amusement as one of his underlings addressed the assembled crowd. "This is what your people bring to our war council," the Keth officer chittered, directing his multifaceted eyes toward Elias. "You seek to speak on behalf of humanity? The soft creatures from the dirt bowl known as Earth." The laughter swelled again. Elias clenched his jaw. He had been in difficult negotiations before, but nothing like this. The Keth Empire was one of the most feared and ancient civilizations in the known galaxy, a species that had crushed rival empires beneath their clawed feet for centuries. And now, humanity, the relative newcomers to the galactic scene, had been granted an audience with them, an audience that had turned into a public spectacle of mockery. Beside him, Lieutenant Cassandra Cass Voss muttered under her breath. "We've been here 5 minutes, and they're already measuring us for body bags." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow breath and tried to recall every lesson he had ever learned in diplomacy. But how do you negotiate with a species that sees you as little more than an amusing afterthought? The Keth officer continued, his mandibles clicking with condescension. "Tell me, human, why should we recognize your species? You are weak, primitive, unsuited for war. You live on a single planet and have barely scratched the surface of true conquest." He turned to the Imperator. "They come here begging for an alliance, yet they have nothing to offer. No strength. No legacy. No history." The Imperator, still silent, tapped his massive claws against the stone throne. Watching. Judging. Elias felt the weight of every diplomat who had come before him. Every human who had stepped into an alien court and fought for recognition. He had to say something. Something that wouldn't just make humanity look like desperate beggars. "We're not here to beg," Elias said, his voice steady. "We're here to negotiate as equals." That earned another wave of derisive clicking. The Keth officer scoffed. "Equals? Your kind are barely out of your infancy." Cass exhaled sharply. "I swear to God, if I had a credit for every time a high and mighty alien race called us infants." Elias raised a hand slightly, signaling her to hold back. He wasn't done. "Humanity may be young," he continued, looking directly at the Imperator now. "But we are not without history. Not without legacy." The Imperator's gaze was unreadable, but the hall had quieted slightly. The amusement remained, but there was also curiosity. The Keth officer waved a claw dismissively. "Your history is meaningless. You have no great wars that shake the stars. No ancient bloodlines stretching back eons. What history do you possibly—" Elias cut him off. "What if I told you," he said slowly, "that we speak the language of your ancestors?" The silence was immediate. Every alien in the hall froze. The laughter, the derision, it died in an instant. Even the Keth officer, so smug and condescending a moment ago, hesitated. The Imperator's claws stopped tapping. Elias saw the sudden shift in their postures. The tension. The disbelief. The way the Imperator himself leaned forward slightly, his massive form casting a long shadow. Elias swallowed. He was playing a dangerous game, but if the reaction in the room was anything to go by, he had just hit on something that had never been expected. "The language of our ancestors," the Imperator finally spoke, his voice a deep, resonant growl. "You dare claim such a thing?" Elias had no idea what exactly he had stumbled onto, but he wasn't about to back down. He nodded. "Yes. I do." The Imperator studied him, his mandibles shifting in thought. Then he gestured with a claw. "Prove it." Elias felt his pulse hammering. He had been bluffing, but now? Now, he had to deliver. Cass shot him a sharp look. Tell me you actually have something. Elias wet his lips, his mind racing. He remembered the reports, old, scattered findings from xenoarchaeologists, fragments of language and symbols found in ruins on the outskirts of Keth space. The language had never been deciphered, but linguists had noted eerie similarities to certain Earth languages. A connection that had never been taken seriously. Until now. He took a step forward. And he spoke. The words were slow, careful, half-remembered from the obscure reports he had read back at the embassy. They felt foreign on his tongue, but he forced himself to say them anyway. The effect was immediate. The hall erupted, not in laughter, but in a stunned, almost fearful whisper. Keth warriors stepped back as if he had just invoked some long-dead ghost. Even the officer who had mocked him seemed visibly shaken. The Imperator's eyes locked onto Elias with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. That language, the Imperator rumbled. Where did you learn it? Elias took a steady breath. He had no idea what the words meant. But he could tell, just from the reaction, that they carried weight. We have records, he said carefully. Old records. Fragments of knowledge from the ruins of dead worlds. The Imperator stared at him for a long, heavy moment. Then, he stood. The sound of his armored bulk shifting was like the grinding of ancient stone. You claim to speak the language of the ancestors, the Imperator said. Then you will come with us. Elias barely had time to react before the Keth warriors moved forward, their spears no longer just ceremonial decorations. Cass took a step back. I don't like where this is going. Neither did Elias. Because, in that moment, he realized the laughter was gone. And in its place was something far worse. Fear. The moment Elias and Cass were escorted from the grand hall, the atmosphere shifted. Gone was the mockery and condescension. The Keth no longer saw them as mere curiosities. Now, there was something else. Something unsettling. The Imperator's personal guards, towering warriors clad in obsidian-like armor, flanked them as they were led deeper into the fortress. The grand ceremonial halls gave way to darker corridors, carved from stone that seemed far older than even the Keth Empire itself. The bioluminescent lighting dimmed, replaced by flickering torches, actual torches, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Cass leaned in, keeping her voice low. I really don't like this. Elias didn't respond immediately. He was still trying to process what had just happened. He had bluffed, taken a gamble on old, half-deciphered ruins and linguistic scraps, but the reaction from the Keth had been extreme. One of the guards shoved him forward, not roughly, but enough to remind him that they were no longer guests. We are taking you to the Imperator's sanctum, the lead warrior chittered, his voice guttural and low. There, you will prove your claim. Elias nodded, masking his uncertainty with forced confidence. Fine. But I need to understand, what exactly is this language to you? The warrior hesitated before answering. It is forbidden. Cass exhaled sharply. That's not ominous at all. Elias frowned. Forbidden? Why? The warrior did not respond. They continued deeper into the fortress, eventually arriving at an enormous set of doors. Unlike the rest of the fortress, these were different, not made of stone, but of some ancient metal, blackened and worn with age. Strange glyphs, similar to the ones Elias had seen in the archaeological reports, ran along the surface, glowing faintly as they approached. The Imperator stood before the doors, his massive form casting a long shadow. These doors, he rumbled, have not been opened in over 10,000 cycles. Elias exchanged a glance with Cass. That long? The Imperator's mandibles twitched. Because what lies beyond is the last remnant of the ancestors. And their language is their curse. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elias felt a bead of sweat form on his brow. Then why bring us here? The Imperator turned his many-eyed gaze toward him. Because you spoke it. With a single motion, the Imperator reached forward and placed one of his colossal claws on the doors. They trembled. A deep, Resonant hum vibrated through the air as ancient mechanisms awakened for the first time in millennia. Dust cascaded down from above, and slowly, agonizingly, the doors began to open. Beyond them lay darkness. Cold. Heavy. The kind of darkness that didn't just swallow light but seemed to devour sound as well. The Imperator gestured. Enter. Elias took a steadying breath. You first. The Keth guards chittered in what might have been amusement, though it was strained, uneasy. The Imperator led the way. Inside, the chamber was vast. No, vast wasn't the right word. It was cavernous, impossibly large, stretching beyond the limits of the fortress itself. The walls were lined with massive stone tablets, etched with symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And at the center of it all stood something neither Elias nor Cass had expected. A throne. Not like the one in the Grand Hall, not a seat of power. This was something else. It was ancient, twisted, and somehow wrong. A massive construct of dark metal and stone, covered in glyphs that pulsed with the same eerie energy as the walls. And it was occupied. Elias stopped cold. There, sitting upon the throne, was a figure. At first glance, it looked Keth. Its exoskeletal form was similar to theirs, but its body was thinner, elongated, its features almost skeletal. Its carapace was cracked, worn, and covered in the same glowing glyphs. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to stretch endlessly. Cass inhaled sharply. Elias. He knew. This wasn't a statue. This wasn't a corpse. It was alive. Barely. The Imperator took a step forward and spoke. His voice, usually commanding, was hushed with reverence. The last one. The figure did not move. But then, slowly, agonizingly, its head turned. And it spoke. Not in the Keth tongue. Not in Galactic standard. But in the language Elias had spoken. The room seemed to tremble at the sound of it. Cass tensed. Elias, tell me you understand what it's saying. Elias' heart pounded in his chest. He only recognized fragments. Pieces. But the meaning was clear enough. Why, have you awakened me? The Imperator bowed his massive head. We did not. These humans, they spoke the words. The last one's hollow gaze shifted toward Elias. He felt a chill run through him as those empty eyes locked onto his. Human. The voice was like a whisper carried through eternity. You speak the tongue of the forgotten. Elias forced himself to stay steady. We found fragments. Ancient ruins. We didn't know. You should not have come here. The last one's voice grew heavier, as if the weight of entire civilizations rested upon its words. The Keth buried the past for a reason. The Imperator's mandibles clicked. Tell them, he rumbled. Tell them what we are. The last one was silent for a long moment. Then it spoke a single word. A word that sent visible shockwaves through the Keth warriors. A word Elias barely understood, but instinctively knew was something terrible. Exiles. The Imperator closed his eyes, his posture rigid. Cass whispered. Elias, what the hell does that mean? Elias swallowed. It means, the Keth weren't always what they are now. The last one shifted, its skeletal frame creaking. We were something greater. Until we defied the ones who made us. The Imperator finally spoke, his voice heavy. And we paid the price. Elias' mind raced. Everything he had assumed about the Keth, about their dominance, their power, it was all wrong. They weren't conquerors, he murmured. They were refugees. The Imperator's eyes snapped to him. And in that moment, Elias realized the true weight of what he had uncovered. The Keth Empire, the most feared civilization in the galaxy, wasn't an empire at all. It was the last remnant of a fallen people. Hiding. Running. Waiting for a past they had tried to bury to finally catch up with them. And now, because of him, it had. The silence that followed the revelation was suffocating. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. The Keth, the proud, fearsome warriors of the galaxy, were exiles? Refugees from something older, something more terrifying than even their war-thirsty empire? Cass shifted beside him, her hand unconsciously hovering near the sidearm at her waist. Elias, I have a really bad feeling about this. He couldn't blame her. Every instinct screamed that they had uncovered something they were never meant to see. The last one sat motionless upon its ancient throne, its hollow eyes fixed on Elias. Its voice came again, heavy as stone grinding against itself. You have brought back the old tongue. That which was meant to die with me. You are a fool. Elias swallowed. I didn't mean to. It does not matter. The last one's voice sent a deep vibration through the chamber. The past does not forget. And now, neither will they. Something shifted in the air. A change so profound that even the Keth warriors stiffened, their antennae twitching in alarm. Then, the chamber began to hum. The glyphs on the walls flared brighter, the symbols pulsing faster, no longer just glowing, they were reacting. The Imperator's mandibles tightened. No. Not now. Elias turned sharply. Not now what? The last one let out a dry, rasping sound. They have heard. And they are coming. The walls shook. Cass reached for her weapon. I swear to God, if they turn out to be some eldritch nightmare. She never finished. Because in that instant, the fortress roared. A deep, earth-shattering tremor surged through the ancient halls. The torches flickered, casting twisted shadows as the air itself ripped apart. The doors they had entered through vanished. Not blown open, not destroyed, simply gone, as if erased from existence. In their place, something impossible stepped through. A shape that defied logic. Humanoid, but wrong. Its form flickered, shifting between solid and incorporeal, like it was never truly there. It had no face. No mouth, no eyes, only an endless, shifting void where a head should be. And it spoke in a voice that was not a sound but a feeling that crawled into Elias' skull like ice. You have awakened what was forgotten. The Keth warriors reacted instantly, raising their weapons, but their movements were hesitant, uncertain. The Imperator did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his massive frame radiating fury. You dare set foot here? The thing tilted its head. We never left. The words weren't spoken. They were. As if reality itself was reshaping to accommodate them. Elias felt the weight of it. The sheer presence of this being pressed against his mind like a suffocating force, alien and impossible. The last one finally stirred. It is them, it rasped. The ones who made us. Elias' blood ran cold. The Imperator lunged. For all his size and power, it did not matter. The entity did not move, yet the moment the Imperator struck, his massive clawed hand ceased to exist. One moment it was there. The next, gone. There was no wound. No blood. No severed limb. Just nothing. Cass took a sharp step back. Okay, yeah. We need to leave. The Imperator let out a guttural snarl, but even he hesitated now. The entity took a step forward. And as it moved, space itself broke. Reality fractured around it. Pieces of the chamber distorting, twisting, collapsing into something that was neither light nor darkness. Your line was to be erased. The thing spoke, its words crawling across every surface like shadows come alive. Yet you linger. Elias' mind was racing. He had no idea what he was dealing with. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just an enemy of the Keth. This was the reason they had become exiles. Cass grabbed his arm. Elias, we can't fight that. We have to. But then, Elias did something even he didn't expect. He spoke. Not in Galactic standard. Not in the Keth tongue. But in their language. The ancient, forbidden words he barely understood. The language of the forgotten. And the effect was instant. The entity stopped. The entire chamber froze. For the first time, the formless, impossible being seemed startled. Elias pressed forward. His mouth moved almost on instinct, repeating the words he had seen in the ruins, the fragments of language that had brought him here. The entity shook. And then, in a voice unlike before, it spoke, not in its suffocating, reality-warping presence. But in something else. Something older. You carry what should be dead. Elias clenched his fists. Yeah? Well, maybe your plan didn't work. Cass shot him a wild look. Dude, what are you doing? He didn't know. But something inside him did. More words came. Words he had no right to know. Words that spoke of defiance. And the entity reeled. The Keth warriors watched in disbelief as the impossible happened. The being stumbled. The Imperator's eyes blazed. He turned sharply. Human. Whatever you are doing, finish it. Elias didn't hesitate. He spoke again. Louder. And the chamber responded. The glyphs on the walls, once dim, now burned like fire. The throne upon which the last one sat cracked. And the entity, so untouchable, so beyond reality itself, began to unravel. Its form shuddered, flickered, fractured. For the first time, it felt mortal. It let out a sound, not a voice, not a thought, but a genuine cry. And then, it vanished. The chamber collapsed. Elias barely had time to register what had happened before the entire structure caved in around them. The Imperator roared. Move! Cass grabbed Elias and ran. The warriors followed, the last one left behind, watching as its long-overdue fate consumed it. Stone crumbled, the weight of 10,000 years finally catching up. The glyphs flared, one last surge of power, before dying forever. They barely made it out. The ancient doors sealed shut behind them, locking the past away once more. Elias collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Cass dropped beside him. What the hell was that? The Imperator stood over them, his remaining claw clenched. That, he said slowly, was the reason we ran. Elias looked up at him. And in that moment, he understood. The Keth had not built an empire. They had built a grave. And he had just opened it. The dust settled around them, thick in the air, coating Elias' tongue with the taste of old stone and something older, something ancient and wrong. The massive doors behind them, the ones that had sealed away the horrors within, stood eerily silent. The fortress felt heavier, as if it, too, was mourning something. Elias exhaled, chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. His hands still trembled, his mind still reeling from the impossible thing they had just encountered. Cass sat back against a crumbling column, her face pale. Okay, she breathed, voice hoarse. I need a very strong drink. Elias let out a breathless chuckle. It was hollow. Empty. He had just spoken words that shouldn't exist. Faced something that shouldn't exist. And somehow, he had survived. The Keth warriors stood in rigid silence, their antennae twitching as if they were struggling to process what had just happened. Even the Imperator, so massive, so unwavering in the face of everything, looked different now. Smaller. We were something greater. Until we defied the ones who made us. The last one's words still echoed in Elias' skull. The Keth had once been something else. Not conquerors, not warriors, but subjects. And their creators. His stomach twisted. Cass finally spoke again. So, I'm gonna say it, what the hell just happened? Elias ran a hand over his face. I think, he hesitated. I think I just used their own language against them. Cass blinked. You think? Elias exhaled, staring at his hands as if expecting them to burn. I don't know how I knew those words. I barely understood them, but something in me just did. The Imperator, still silent, stepped forward. His eyes, deep and unreadable, locked onto Elias. You spoke words that have not been uttered in 10,000 cycles. Words that should have been buried. Elias swallowed hard. And yet, somehow, I knew them. The Imperator was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he did something no Keth warrior had ever done before. He knelt. Cass choked on her own breath. What the hell are you doing? The warriors behind him hesitated before following his lead, lowering themselves into a deep, reverent bow. Elias stiffened. His entire soul recoiled. No, 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 he muttered. That's not, whatever you think I am, I'm not. The Imperator spoke, his voice steady. You carry the tongue of the ancestors. You wield the words that break our enemies. He paused. That means you are either our salvation, or our doom. Elias felt the weight of the words sink into his bones. He didn't want this. He didn't want any of this. Cass sat up, waving a hand. Okay, time out. She pointed at Elias. He's a dude from Earth who happens to be a decent linguist, not some kind of ancient Keth prophet. The Imperator studied them. And yet, the enemy recoiled from him. Cass threw up her hands. That's not his fault. He was improvising. The Imperator's mandibles twitched. And yet, the dead language lived in him. Elias clenched his fists. I don't know why. I don't know how. But you're wrong about one thing. The Imperator tilted his head. Elias forced himself to his feet. His body screamed in protest, his muscles aching from exhaustion. But he ignored it. You don't need me, he said. You never did. The Imperator's eyes darkened. You do not understand. No, Elias cut in. You don't understand. He gestured back at the sealed chamber. You've spent thousands of years running, hiding from whatever they were. You built an empire not to conquer, but to survive. And the moment you were forced to face them again, what did you do? Silence. Elias took a step closer. You fought. The Imperator's mandibles tightened. Elias continued, voice low and firm. You lost a hand, but you still fought. You didn't run. You stood your ground. And you know what? He exhaled. That means you don't need to be afraid of them anymore. The Keth warriors shifted, their antennae twitching. Elias took another step forward. Your empire wasn't built on fear. It was built on defiance. And today, you proved that you're more than what they tried to erase. The Imperator studied him for a long, heavy moment. Then, slowly, he rose. You believe we can stand against them? Elias nodded. I do. The Imperator inhaled deeply, his massive chest rising. When he exhaled, something in his posture shifted. He stood taller. Then the Keth will fight. The warriors around him let out a deep, unified chittering cry, a war sound that rumbled through the fortress like thunder. Cass groaned. Great. Just what the galaxy needs. More pissed-off bug warriors. The Imperator turned to Elias. And what of you, human? Elias hesitated. This wasn't his fight. Not really. Humanity had come here looking for an alliance, not an ancient war. But now? Now, he had seen the truth. He had seen what waited in the dark. And he knew, with terrifying certainty, that this was only the beginning. Elias clenched his fists. If you're going to war, he said, then humanity is coming with you. The Imperator's mandibles twitched in something eerily close to a smile. Then let the galaxy tremble. They left the fortress behind, the past sealed away once more. But this time, it was different. Because now, the Keth were no longer hiding from the past. They were preparing for the future. And as Elias stepped onto his ship, a single thought settled in his mind. The laughter was gone. Now, the galaxy would finally learn what humanity really was.